Last Tuesday afternoon, I met with the members of the worship planning team to see how we could make this All Saints' Day especially meaningful. We spent a good bit of time on that part of the service where Lynn Turner was going to read aloud the names of those church members who have died in the past year. And a good bit of that time was spent wondering what we should call it. We finally settled on remembering the saints, which was a good choice. But one of the resources I had suggested that we might call that part of the service the naming of the honored dead. And nobody liked that one. Why is that, I asked? Why do we have such a hard time with the word dead? We say that our loved ones passed away, or that they went home to be with the Lord, but we rarely say that they died. Why is that? Well, it sounds so final, someone said, like it's not only the end of their earthly life, but the end of them somehow. And we don't want to believe that. No, we don't want to believe that, but what would lead us to believe anything else? Where do we get the idea that death is not the end of our loved ones? Back in Old Testament times, people believed that when their loved ones died, they went to Sheol, the place of the dead, which was down there somewhere. It wasn't hell, it wasn't a place of everlasting torment, but it was somewhere down there underground, a kind of huge underground warehouse of the dead. The best commentaries I can find suggest that people believed their loved ones continued in some sort of conscious, shadowy existence down there forever and ever, but it was not the same as life. If you had asked somebody in those days where their great-great-grandfather was, they would have said, down there, Sheol. That's where he would have been. Sometime in the 2nd century BC, people began to talk about the resurrection from the dead. You get the first hint of this in the Bible from Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, which says, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Whereas Sheol was understood to be simply the place of the dead, both the righteous and the wicked, the book of Daniel suggests that the dead who are raised will be judged and will receive everlasting reward or punishment based on what they did in life. So the important thing would be to know, how do I attain righteousness? How can I ensure my inheritance among the saints? The Pharisees, who came about at the same time, that 2nd century BC, began to think that the way to achieve immortality was by being better and more righteous than everyone else, being holier than thou and thou and thou. That's the way to assure that when you die, you receive your eternal reward instead of eternal punishment. It wasn't until Jesus came along, really, that people began to understand God as a good and gracious God who wanted to give the gift of life. All it took was a little faith. Jesus said God loves the world, doesn't want anybody to die. So whoever believes in his Son will not perish, but have everlasting life. The Apostle Paul picked up on this theme in his own writings. Paul, who had been a Pharisee among Pharisees, who had struggled to show himself more righteous than anyone else, who had done everything to fulfill the works of the law, began to change his tune. In Galatians 2:16, he says, "We know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ." In Romans 10:9, he says, "If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." In the space of a few hundred years, people went from believing that death was the end to believing that death didn't have to be the end at all. that it could be the beginning of a whole new life. In fact, some of them began to say that this life that comes after death is even better than the life that comes before death, which was good news to them, especially under the circumstances. Today I'm preaching from the book of Revelation, which is without a doubt the most misunderstood book in the Bible. Because it is full of signs and symbols, some people try to decode it as if it were the latest Dan Brown novel. It's not. But I remember that when I was in my early teens, someone brought a book to our house called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. And I read it. Everybody was reading it in those days. It was the bestseller for a full decade. It spoke of how the world was going to come to an end, and in that book, Hal Lindsey unraveled all the mysteries of Revelation. I don't remember everything that was in the book, but I do remember that he spent a good bit of time talking about the Antichrist, a word that is not even found in the book of Revelation. Did you know that? Mentioned only a few times in the Bible and only in the epistles of John. Hal Lindsey talked a lot about the rapture. Again, a word that is found nowhere in the book of Revelation. Nowhere in the Bible, in fact. The idea is referred to only once, and that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Hal Lindsey talked a lot about the Battle of Armageddon, this great battle, and in that Cold War era believed that the armies of Russia were going to assist the devil in fighting against Jesus and his armies. It was going to be a terrible thing, he said, terrible. It was going to lead to the end of the world, and he predicted with confidence that the world would end in 1988. Well, it didn't. He was wrong. In recent years, the Left Behind series has picked up where Hal Lindsey left off, as Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins have mined the book of Revelation for the stuff of pulp fiction. It's a wonderful read, exciting, thrilling, but it has very little basis in reality or even in the book of Revelation. It is only another version of the late great planet Earth. Now, it's true that the book of Revelation is full of signs and symbols. But the signs and symbols would have been readily understood by the people for whom that book was written near the end of the first century. Revelation is apocalyptic literature. It comes from that Greek word which means to take the cover off, to reveal. It is an effort to reveal to people in a time of intense persecution how things are going to come out in the end.